exceeded those assumptions, which means that the money being paid out is greater than what they expected. So as of June 2009, we were underfunded by about $494,000. Excuse me. Because of that, in 2010, the City Council approved moving monies from our self-insurance fund, where we had some additional funds that were for police and fire set aside, and we've shifted those monies into the retirement plan so that we can become and get to a point where we're fully funded. So we did that. We did that in July 2010. Council approved that. From 2010 to the current date, some things happened. We obviously had the recession, and some of those assets kind of went down. The earnings at least went down. And so for a short period of time, we became underfunded. But more recently, because of better investment returns and because there were some pensioners who passed away sooner than that were expected or assumed, that we are now in a position where we're fully funded. We're virtually fully funded. We're like 99% or so. So now that we are in a fully funded position, and it looks like we might be for a little while, at least that's what the Pension Commission believes, they've asked me to bring to the council a recommendation to increase the monthly pension benefits by 10%. Currently, you'll see this, but there are 4 pensioners remaining, and of those 4, 2 of them are the original retirees, so then they have surviving spouses, so that if and when they go, the surviving spouses will continue. But currently, there are 4 pensioners receiving monthly pensions. So their recommendation would be to increase the total payment from $59.65 to $66.51 as total out the door per month, which amounts to an average of $149 for each pensioner. They're getting different amounts, but not by much, between the range of $1,400 to $1,600 per pensioner. So by doing this, it would change our funded status from 99.8% to 90.7%. So we would be theoretically or actuarially underfunded by about 10%. The Commission's rationale is that it has been at least 20 years, and we believe it's been probably closer to 30 years, that there have been any kind of CPI increase to these pensioners. So what they're receiving today, they have been receiving for at least 20 years and likely for 30 years. And as you know, for our PERS retirement system, there is a built-in CPI given every year to those pensions, right or wrong. And they believe that even at 90.7%, that we're, relatively speaking, particularly, that they are still in a pretty strong position actuarially. The fiscal impacts of such an increase is that there aren't any immediate impacts. It just means that actuarially, that as we measure it today, we would become underfunded by $56,921. Long term, the general fund, as I mentioned earlier, may have to cover that difference and the Commission understands this, but what this means is that the general fund, if everything goes exactly what they assume, all the investment returns come in like they assume, and the people live exactly as long as they expect them to live, there would end up being a shortfall of $56,000 that the general fund would have to make up between now and then. So from our perspective, maybe my perspective, one of the things that it's true about this plan is that since there are only 4 remaining pensioners and 2 of them would have surviving spouses, that there is a lot of volatility in the funded status because as we just saw recently, we were underfunded, but then because of 1 or 2 people died in advance of what they assumed, it had a major impact on our funded status. The other point is that any remaining shortfall or surplus will accrue to the general fund, and I know for a fact, I could tell you that there's no way that that the actuaries are exactly right in terms of how long people are going to live and what we're going to earn. So there is going to be some either surplus or some shortfall at the end of the plan. One way or another, we just don't know what it is. It depends on mostly how long people are going to live relative to the assumptions that were made. So from our perspective, I would just, because we don't know what's going to happen, these are actual evaluations, and they have mortality tables that sort of generally work, at least in large groups, but I would treat this ultimately as a request for funding from the general fund, because we don't know otherwise. We can't assume that we know what's going to happen more than an actuary would assume. So I think we should just treat this as a request from the general fund long term that we may have to come up with $56,000 to make up this additional CPI increase or the 10% increase in their pension benefits. So at this point, we're just bringing a recommendation from the Commission to committee and then ultimately council. We're going to present this next week to the full council, but we're looking for a recommendation from the Finance Committee.
Okay, thank you. Questions from committee members? Mr. Hart.
Yes. Did the commission talk about future CPI increases? You know, I think this is looking back historically and attempting to kind of address, you know, the past and the very, very long time for any kind of adjustment at all. But as a policy, did they have any kind of discussion about what about happens next year?
Committee Member Hart, no, they didn't. They really didn't talk long term. They just felt like it's been such a long time that they'd do some kind of an increase. I think they recognize, though, that actuarially it would be hard to sort of assume we're going to be giving annual increases because it would just put us further into a deficit, if you will. But I will say that my guess is if in 3 years from now we find that we are overfunded, they may look at that point to maybe recommend another increase. So I think their recommendations will stem from how we're doing actuarially going forward.
Thank you.
Mr. White? No question. Just out of curiosity, so let's assume that someone joined the police department in 1964 before PERS. Would they have been for their entire career in the old 1937 system?
Yes.
Okay. And then...
And let me follow.
Yes, please.
And I'm not 100% sure, but I think at that point that they had an option to either shift over to PERS or to stay with the existing plan. And so some decided they wanted to stay.
Okay. The other question is, how is it that the board that's overseeing this pension never thought about CPI increases over a period of 2 or 3 decades? Right.
Mr. Chair, I think the answer is because from 92 all the way up to 2009, it's been a progression. It's been, the funded status has progressively gotten worse. I don't know that we were ever in a position where we had a surplus. It's just over time, people lived longer than they expected, and that underfunded status grew during that period of time. But I don't know. It's possible that 15 years ago we had a surplus and maybe they didn't consider it. I don't know. My guess is that we just sort of progressively been moving toward a more and more or greater unfunded status.
Okay, thank you. All right, I would entertain a motion on this.
Well, I would move the staff recommendation with the comment that this seems like a fairness has been absent from this group for a little while. That doesn't sound, I mean, and obviously I've been very concerned about our pension system from the other side, but that this is a situation where these folks, besides living longer than they expected, perhaps there's more inflation than was expected during those earlier years, and that was not built in as a concept so much as it now everybody fears it more. And of course now we're in more of a deflationary environment, but that was not part of the conversation in the 30s and 40s as it is now. So anyway, I certainly move staff recommendation.
And just to clarify, this is not a staff recommendation. This is really a recommendation from the commissioners.
Commission recommendation, then. Thank you. But staff agrees with it. You're neutral, really.
I'm neutral. Again, it just, to me, I would look at it as a request for general fund funding, and I'm more neutral on that. I mean, I understand the fairness issue.
Yeah. And I think that also the business about the actuarials of 4 people who are in their 80s and 90s is obviously not I mean, that's just so unknown that we don't know where that's going to land.
It's true.
I'll second the motion. And just, do you know precisely the ages? There, the 4 people. Do you not each individually? What is the range of ages?
They're the youngest. There's one person who's sort of an outlier. He is 73 years old, but the other 3 are in their late 80s or early 90s.
Okay.
And amazingly, that when they look at their life expectancy, it's still a number of years. I mean, even people in their late 90s are expected to live another 10 years, and it's this actual thing that the older you get, the longer you're expected to live.
You've been lucky so far.
Yeah, exactly. Nothing's hit them. No buses hit them.
Okay. All right. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor? Aye. Motion passes.
Great, thank you. And then again, this will be a full report to council next Tuesday. The second item, Matt Fore, our Environmental Services Manager, will cover.
Thank you. Mr. Fore.
Good afternoon, committee members. Which one's which? This one? Okay. Alrighty. Welcome. Good afternoon, committee members. I have a fairly brief presentation today, and we're going to talk about we're bringing to you for consideration and a recommendation to council a proposed agreement with Marburg for the processing and revenue sharing of commingled recyclables that are collected in dumpster containers. We're going to go over a couple things, a little bit of background about where recyclables in the city go, how we collect them, talk a little bit about the proposed terms of the contract, give our analysis of the agreement, and then again to repeat the staff recommendation to council. So by way of background, our recycling system is robust in the city, and what we're talking about is the blue bin. So whether it's a cart, a can, or a dumpster in the city, we've all seen those. We're talking about the blue-colored containers where customers of all types, whether they be residential or commercial, take paper, plastic, bottles, cans, newspaper, and specifically put those into that container. And for the purposes of the agreement, we use a defined term called recyclable material, and that's just, again, talking about the source-separated paper, plastic, metal, cardboard, and glass, primarily that we pick up from customers. So what happens to the city's recyclable material? It's all collected by Marburg. Marburg's our single hauler, and they're collecting these blue containers, whether they be carts, cans, or dumpsters, from all customer types. And this is more of a general material flow. All of that material in any city on the South Coast, it all goes to a recycling facility where it's separated into the individual commodity types of paper, plastic, cardboard. They're then baled separately and then sold on the open market across the world. So for carts and cans, our carts and can material and the blue carts and cans actually is transferred at the county transfer station by the county and driven down to Ventura to Gold Coast Recycling. We've had a long-standing agreement with the county that went back to about 2005, where they do the trucking on behalf of the city, they transfer the material, and then we actually receive a portion of the revenue that's generated from the sale of those commodities. It comes back to the city through the county. For dumpsters, however, the dumpsters are collected by Marburg, taken to a small recycling facility that's operated by Marburg out at David Love Place by the airport. Marburg then separates that material, ships it to market, sells it, and historically Marburg has kept the revenue. And that's one of the things we're trying to change through this agreement, is that they'll continue to provide that service to the city, but the city will share in the proceeds of the sale of that material. So graphically specific to us, this is just a little matrix. As we said, the carts and cans are collected by Marburg, processed by Gold Coast Recycling, and the city does share in the revenue from the sales of that material. The dumpsters, however, we do not, and we have not historically. So the agreement that we have drafted with Marburg, we worked on this after the execution of the franchise agreement. That's something that we talked about with the Solid Waste Ad Hoc Committee. That's something we would quickly follow up on, but we intentionally separated this contract from the franchise agreement, primarily because of the volatility in the commodity markets. The franchise agreement is very stable. We negotiated terms with Marburg on very stable premise that we wouldn't really change, and based on their revenues and things over the next 10 years. And we intentionally kept this out, so as the markets rise and fall, or primarily fall, they wouldn't come back to the city and ask for rate increases. So the scope of work for this is that Marburg will continue to process, separate, and market recyclable material collected from the blue dumpsters in the city. They'll provide the facility, the labor, the transportation, and maintain the permits. They will then remit a portion of that revenue from the sales back to the city. And just to note, the physical collection of the material and all the trucks and drivers, that's all governed by the franchise agreement. This agreement starts at the moment that that truck crosses the threshold into the David Love facility. So a couple comments on the contract terms. The length of the agreement is 5 years. It's retroactive to January 1st of 2014, and it would go as long as 2018, June 30th, 2018. Similar to the franchise agreement, however, there is a early termination provision that's at the request of the city, and that's if the city were to join into a regional waste management initiative similar to the Resource Recovery Project. Then we'll be able to redirect this material to really the more appropriate facility. This is a good short-term measure, but ultimately the Resource Recovery Project would be more appropriate. The payment terms, Marburg will be paying the city a flat rate of $30.44 per ton, and it's on all source-separated recyclables collected in dumpsters, and it ties neatly back to the monthly report that they submit to the city, so we'll simply take that number, multiply it by 3044, and that's our predictable payment. There is an annual CPI adjustment, and then Marburg will also be the reporting agent to state agencies like Cal Recycle on the city's behalf for our diversion performance. So our analysis of the agreement, these payment terms are competitive. The per ton rate of $30.44. I went back and looked at the commodity markets and what we fetched at market between 2009 and 2013. Had we been under this agreement, we would have netted a median rate of $29.89, so it's right in the ballpark. I then checked with the county, and under a very similar agreement between the county and Marburg, they're getting paid $26.44 a ton, so it's slightly better than what the county is getting. In terms of the estimated revenues, we are predicting, which is already budgeted, to net $75,000 for the last 6 months of fiscal year 14, as well as fiscal year 15. We budgeted $50,000 and $100,000 respectively, and our tonnages have just risen a little bit since we made those initial budgetary predictions. We also anticipate, well, I'll get to that, but we also anticipate that number, the volume number, to actually grow as Marburg achieves its diversion mandates in the contract. So the other thing that we like about the agreement is that it's stable. Our carts and cans, we ride the market. We collect carts and cans, we ship them to market, and whatever the market's willing to pay, we fetch, we pay the county for their service fees, and we net the rest. It's been very volatile. On the good years, we've netted upwards of $42.52 a ton, and on the bad years, we've actually paid $3.19 a ton to dispose of the material because the market's just dropped out. So for this agreement, it is nice to have a stable element in our diversion portfolio that we can count on. And as I said, there's a potential for revenue growth from volume as we through Marburg shift more of that commingled material to the blue can. As the volumes rise, so will the payments to the city. And lastly, it is a sound short-term solution. You know, if we were to do this for the long term, we would put out an RFP and do a full due diligence procedure like we would with any other contract. We were looking for a short-term measure that would bridge the gap between receiving no payments now and the eventual, if approved, construction of the Resource Recovery Project, where we'll set up some sort of term for revenue sharing with that vendor. So the staff recommendation is we're requesting the committee to recommend to council authorizing the finance director to execute a contract with Marburg Industries for processing of recyclable material, as you've seen. And we'll be taking that to the council next week on the 17th. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Very good. Questions from the committee? Mr. Hart?
Well, given the volatility of the market over the time period that you looked at, I'm curious why Marburg would agree to a set amount that's at the higher end of that volatility range.
In my experience, they are very good at finding markets, for one. They have very good relationships with brokers. I mean, they do go through the volatility like everybody, but they're finding markets for all kinds of materials. It's this material, it's all the material coming out of their C&D facility. They're a fairly large volume player, and that opens the gates for access to other markets that smaller facilities wouldn't have. So partly is that they're good at it. The other main reason is that these terms are a lot better than the city pulling 6,000 tons of material out of a relatively small recycling center. You know, we have the ability to redirect our material to Gold Coast, for example, if we wanted to. That would cost Marburg a lot of money, probably $1 million a year. And so they have an incentive to continue to be our service provider.
Because it's necessary for the economy of scale of the rest of their operation.
Yes.
Okay. And is there some connection between Marburg's ability to do this more nimbly, for example, than the county? It seems like the county's operation, where we ended up paying $3 a ton, is that certainly there's a volume there. That's not the difference between Marburg and the county operation. Was Marburg in a similar environment when we were paying $3?
They certainly were. $3 was 2008, 2009 when the global markets crashed, and there was very little difference between one's ability to find markets in a global, collapsing market. The difference today, where you have healthy markets, is the cleanliness of the material. So the cleaner the bales, the higher the revenue that's fetched at market. I don't know if you've heard about something called China's green fence, where they're now inspecting 20% of all the loads coming in. Vendors that can clean up their bales and make it through the customs inspections in China, make a lot of money. When I went out and looked at Marburg's facility, one of the things that's beneficial to them is that it's small and they use a lot of manual labor to hand pick material on a very slow line. Other highly automated materials, the belt speeds could be 20 miles an hour. This is a very manageable 2 miles an hour, where they're hand picking and keeping paper and cardboard and things pristine. So that's another reason why I believe they perform well at market.
So they're generating a higher quality product and getting a higher price for it as a result, and that's their model, and that's why they're comfortable with the price point, and so it is sustainable going forward. Okay, well, thank you. That helps answer my questions.
I would speculate this, Mr. Chair, too, is that that the crash it's like the stock market, where, you want to look at the range of the stock market in the last 5 years. It was from, 6,000 to 16. Well, it wasn't at 6,000 for very long. And I bet that cheap recyclable was for a very short period of time. And, nothing was sustainable at that time. Another thing I remember hearing about Marburg at that time was, for example, they're warehousing at that time, even some of the metals were going into a place down in the Ventura County area, where they're rat-holing that stuff for a time when they could get some real money for it, when at the time it would otherwise it just would have flowed through at the low cost aspect. So that's the nimble part that you were asking about, that this is an operator that's trying to maximize their value there. So we get to share in that a little bit.
And I would say congratulations to the free market system at work, even if it is a regulated utility. Okay, so do we have a motion for a recommendation to City Council on this?
I'll move the staff recommendation.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.